Case 1. Hailey Dandurand. Location: North Shore, Oahu, December 7, 2017. The North Shore of Oahu is famous for two things: the biggest waves in the world, and a kind of small-town intimacy that persists despite the tourist traffic. Vacation rentals to the coastline between Kalua and Sunset Beach, tucked behind hedges and surfboard racks, rented out week to families chasing the perfect winter swell. It was inside one of these rentals, on the night of December 7, 2017, that 51-year-old Thelma Boinville, a mother and a schoolteacher, was doing what she often did: managing the property, checking in on guests, making sure everything ran smoothly for the families staying there over the holidays. She never made it home that night. Hailey Dandurand and her boyfriend, Stephen Brown, arrived at the rental property with violence already decided. According to prosecutors, the two broke into the home where Boinville was working and attacked her without warning. What followed was not a robbery gone wrong or a single act of panic. It was, according to the evidence presented at trial, a brutal and sustained assault. Boinville was beaten and slashed to death inside the property she had come to manage in good faith. But the horror did not end with Boinville's murder. Also inside the home was her 8-year-old daughter. Rather than flee the scene, Dandurand and Brown turned their attention to the child. The little girl was bound and kidnapped, taken from the place where her mother had just been killed, and held by the two attackers as they attempted to escape the consequences of what they had done. For investigators with the Honolulu Police Department, the case became one of the most urgent in recent North Shore history. A homicide compounded by an active child abduction, unfolding in real time on an island where major violent crime against strangers is comparatively rare. The search for the girl, and for the two suspects, moved quickly. Detectives pieced together the physical evidence at the scene, forensic material linking Dandurand and Brown to the crime, while working to locate the missing child before further harm could come to her. The girl was ultimately recovered, though the trauma of witnessing her mother's murder and then being taken by the people responsible would follow her for the rest of her life. Dandurand and Brown were both taken into custody and charged in connection with Boinville's murder, the kidnapping of her daughter, burglary, and the theft of a vehicle used in their attempted escape. The case moved through the Hawaii court system for years, as cases involving multiple violent felony counts often do. Evidence had to be tested. Timelines had to be reconstructed. Prosecutors built a case not just around the killing itself, but around the calculated nature of what followed: the decision to take a child rather than leave her behind, the burglary that preceded the violence, the vehicle theft that followed it. On December 6, 2023, almost exactly 6 years to the day after Thelma Boinville was killed, Circuit Court Judge Rowena Somerville handed down her sentence. Dandurand was ordered to serve 2 consecutive life terms with the possibility of parole for her role in the murder, along with an additional 30 years to be served for the burglary, kidnapping, and vehicle theft charges connected to the case. 2 consecutive life terms. Not concurrent, consecutive. It was a sentence that reflected the severity the court assigned not just to the killing of an innocent woman going about her job, but to the decision to extend that violence to an 8-year-old child who had done nothing but be present in her mother's workplace. For the North Shore community, the case became a quiet but permanent scar, a reminder that even in one of the most tightly knit stretches of Oahu, evil does not always announce itself with a warning. Thelma Boinville went to work that night the way she had countless nights before. She did not come home. If this case affected you, take a moment, breathe, and remember to hit that subscribe button so more stories like Thelma's are never forgotten. Drop a comment below if you remember this case from local news coverage. Now, let's move north, to a fugitive who didn't just hide from the law in Hawaii. She hid from an entire missing children's investigation. Case 2. Lori Vallow Daybell. Location: Kauai, Hawaii. Arrest on February 20, 2020. Some of the cases on this list involve crimes committed within the borders of Hawaii. This one is different, and in some ways, more chilling for exactly that reason. The murders at the center of this story happened thousands of miles away, in Idaho. But it was here, on the island of Kauai, that the final act of the cover-up played out in front of a stunned national audience. By early 2020, Lori Vallow Daybell was already the subject of an active missing children's investigation. Her 2 youngest children, 7-year-old Joshua J.J. Vallow and 16-year-old Tylee Ryan, had not been seen in months. Family members were raising alarms. Law enforcement in Idaho was demanding answers. And instead of cooperating, instead of producing her children or explaining where they were, Vallow Daybell did something that would come to define the case in the public imagination. She left the mainland entirely. She and her new husband, Chad Daybell, a man she had married only weeks after his previous wife died suddenly, and only weeks after Vallow Daybell's own husband was fatally shot, relocated to the island of Kauai. There, the couple settled into what appeared, from the outside, to be an idyllic tropical routine. They were photographed doing yoga on the beach. They rented a home. They carried on with their lives while a court back in Idaho grew increasingly furious at their refusal to produce the missing children or even acknowledge, under oath, where they were. An Idaho judge issued an order demanding that Vallow Daybell physically produce her children. She ignored it. The order was reissued with increasing urgency. She continued to ignore it. What played out on Kauai was not a fugitive hiding in the shadows. It was a woman living openly in paradise while defying a direct court order tied to two missing minors, an image that captured national headlines and turned the case into one of the most closely watched of the era. The Kauai Police Department, working in coordination with authorities on the mainland, eventually moved to make the arrest. On February 20th, 2020, Vallow Daybell was taken into custody on Kauai on an Idaho warrant, with bail set at an extraordinary $5 million, a figure that reflected both the severity of the allegations and the very real flight risk she had already demonstrated by leaving the state in the first place. What followed was one of the most harrowing revelations in recent true crime history. The bodies of J.J. Vallow and Tylee Ryan were eventually discovered buried on property belonging to Chad Daybell in Idaho. The investigation revealed a disturbing pattern: alleged doomsday religious beliefs, financial motives tied to insurance policies and inheritance, and a conspiracy that also implicated the couple in the death of Chad Daybell's first wife, Tammy Daybell. Vallow Daybell was extradited from Hawaii back to Idaho to face trial. The proceedings that followed exposed, in granular and often disturbing detail, the beliefs and choices that led to the deaths of her two children. She was ultimately convicted on all charges related to the murders and the conspiracy to murder Tammy Daybell, and in 2023, she was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Hawaii, the case remains a strange footnote in a story that mostly played out elsewhere, but it is an essential one. Kauai was not incidental to this case. It was the stage for the final, most public phase of the cover-up, the place where a mother chose vacation photos over compliance with a court order demanding to know where her children were. It is a sobering reminder that paradise can just as easily become a hiding place as a home. This case reminds us why verification matters in true crime storytelling. Every fact here is drawn from court records and extradition proceedings. If you want more deep dives into cases that cross state lines, make sure that subscribe button is lit up. Up next, we head to Kapolei for a case that is still unfolding in real time. Case 3, Janae Perez and Ashleigh Utley. Location, Kapolei, Oahu. Child died June 13, 2024. Some cases on this list concluded years ago, with sentences handed down and appeals resolved. This case is not one of them. It remains active in the Hawaii court system, and every detail included here reflects only what has been charged and alleged in court filings and law enforcement statements. Nothing more. The presumption of innocence applies fully to both defendants named in this case. On June 13, 2024, emergency responders were called to a home in Kapolei, Oahu, after a report of an unresponsive child. What they found inside would launch one of the most disturbing child welfare investigations in recent Hawaii history. A 3-year-old girl, Sarai Perez Rivera, was found without a pulse. She was transported to a nearby medical center, where she was pronounced dead. 3 of her siblings, ranging in age from toddlers to early elementary school, were also found in the home and were hospitalized, suffering from what investigators would later describe as extreme dehydration and signs of prolonged neglect. What began as an investigation into a single child's death quickly widened into something much larger. Detectives with the Honolulu Police Department's homicide detail say the case was initially classified as an unattended death, a heartbreaking but not uncommon designation for a sudden child fatality. But as investigators dug deeper, working with the Honolulu Medical Examiner's Office, the classification changed. This was not a tragic accident. This, prosecutors would later allege, was the result of sustained, deliberate deprivation. The medical examiner's autopsy findings, later made part of the public court record, described a child whose body showed the effects of prolonged starvation and dehydration, findings that painted a picture investigators say was entirely inconsistent with a home that, according to police, had ample food available. The two adults in the home, Janae Perez, the child's mother, and her partner, Ashleigh Utley, were arrested in the weeks following Chesiree's death. Investigators allege that the children in the household were restricted to a strict, minimal daily water allowance and were denied regular access to food despite full pantries and refrigerators in the home. Cell phone evidence recovered during the investigation reportedly included footage showing children confined to a bedroom and a recording of the surviving children in visible distress. In March of 2025, an Oahu grand jury returned an indictment against both Perez and Utley on multiple felony counts, including second-degree murder, kidnapping, and first-degree assault, along with additional misdemeanor charges tied to the alleged treatment of Chesiree's surviving siblings. Both women were ordered held without bail at the Oahu Community Correctional Center, with the presiding judge citing the danger they were determined to pose, not only in connection with the child who died, but to the 3 surviving children removed from their care. The case has also raised uncomfortable questions about the child welfare system in Hawaii. Family members of the victim have publicly stated that concerns about the household were raised with state child welfare services well before Chesiree's death, concerns that, according to those relatives, were not adequately acted upon. A lawsuit filed by a family member against the state's Department of Human Services alleges that the agency was aware of red flags in the household months before the fatal incident. As of this recording, both Janae Perez and Ashleigh Utley await trial. They have not been convicted of any crime, and under the law, they are entitled to the presumption of innocence until and unless a jury determines otherwise. The 3 surviving children remain in the state's protective custody, and the case continues to move through Oahu's circuit court system. This case is a difficult reminder of why child welfare systems matter, and why community vigilance matters too. If you or someone you know has concerns about a child's safety in Hawaii, the Child Abuse Reporting Line is available around the clock. Please like this video and subscribe so you don't miss our follow-up coverage when this case reaches trial. Next, we go back more than half a decade to a marriage that ended in a bloody cover story. Case 4, Evelin Iturbide. Location, Mauna Lua, Oahu, February 17, 2018. Mauna Lua is a quiet, largely residential neighborhood on Oahu, home to a significant number of military families given its proximity to several major installations. It was here, inside a home shared by a young married couple, that 24-year-old Marine Sergeant 1 Iturbide was fatally stabbed on the night of February 17, 2018. The story his wife, Evelin Iturbide, initially told police was one of a home invasion gone tragically wrong. According to her account, she had heard an argument taking place outside their home. Moments later, she said, she found her husband bleeding at the front door, the apparent victim of an attack by an unknown assailant who had fled into the night. For a period, investigators worked the case as presented, canvassing the neighborhood, searching for any sign of an intruder, treating Sergeant Iturbide's death as the result of an external threat to the household. But forensic evidence gathered at the scene began to tell a different story, one that did not match the timeline or physical details Evelin Iturbide had described to detectives. As the investigation progressed, prosecutors say the forensic picture increasingly pointed not to an intruder, but to Iturbide herself. The physical evidence, details about the wound patterns, the blood evidence inside the home, and inconsistencies in her account of the night's events, became central to the case that would eventually be built against her. Evelin Iturbide was charged in connection with her husband's death. The case moved to trial, where prosecutors laid out the forensic contradictions in her original story alongside evidence they argued demonstrated intent and opportunity inconsistent with a stranger having entered the home. In August of 2021, a jury found her guilty of manslaughter, a verdict that reflected the jury's conclusion that Sergeant Iturbide's death was not accidental, but also fell short of the more severe murder charges initially associated with cases of this nature. On November 15, 2021, Iturbide was sentenced to the maximum allowable term, 20 years in prison. For the family of Sergeant Iturbide, a young Marine who had served his country and whose life was cut short inside his own home, the sentencing brought a measure of closure after years of uncertainty and a trial that forced them to relive the details of his death in open court. That closure, however, proved incomplete. In 2023, the Hawaii Intermediate Court of Appeals vacated Iturbide's manslaughter conviction, ordering a new trial. The court's ruling centered not on the underlying forensic evidence, but on procedural issues, specifically concerns regarding how the jury had been selected and limitations that had been placed on cross-examination during the original trial. It was a decision that, while not exonerating Iturbide or casting doubt on the physical evidence in the case, reset the legal clock and reopened a painful chapter for Sergeant Iturbide's family and fellow service members. As of this recording, the matter remains subject to further legal proceedings in the Hawaii Circuit Court system, following the appellate court's order. The case stands as a stark example of how the machinery of the justice system can extend a family's wait for resolution years beyond an initial verdict, and how forensic evidence, however compelling, must still be weighed within the strict procedural framework that governs a fair trial. Cases like this one show why appellate review matters, even when it delays justice for grieving families. If you appreciate documentaries that don't skip the messy, unresolved parts of true crime, hit subscribe, because we cover every angle, not just the convenient ending. Next up, a killing so recent, the case is still making headlines this year. Case 5, Sinaleen Joseph. Location, Makiki, Honolulu, March 27, 2026. This is the most recent case on our list, a homicide that occurred just months before this documentary was produced, and one that remains in the earliest stages of the Hawaii court process. As with any recently charged case, the facts described here reflect allegations made by law enforcement and prosecutors, not a finalized legal determination of guilt. Makiki is a dense, largely residential neighborhood pressed up against the base of the mountains behind downtown Honolulu, known for its mix of older apartment buildings and quiet side streets. It was behind one of those apartment complexes, in a stream running along the edge of the property, that the body of 46-year-old Chesiree Ikiek was discovered in late March of 2026. According to investigators, Ikiek had been stabbed 7 times. The location of the body, hidden in a natural drainage feature just steps from residential units, initially complicated the picture for responding officers, who had to work to establish both the circumstances of the death and the identity of whoever was responsible. The individual named by police in connection with the killing was 23-year-old Sina Joseph, also reported in some records as Sinaleen Joseph, who police say was Ikiek's girlfriend. According to investigators, Joseph allegedly confessed to a family member in the aftermath of the killing, telling them that she had stabbed Ikiek because, in her words, he routinely beat her. That alleged admission, if substantiated through the legal process, introduces one of the most difficult and recurring themes in cases involving intimate partner violence: the blurred and legally fraught line between self-defense, retaliation, and a killing that a jury may ultimately determine crossed into criminal culpability. The Honolulu Police Department moved quickly following the discovery of Ikiek's body, and Joseph was taken into custody in the investigation's early stages. On April 7, 2026, an Oahu grand jury formally indicted her on a charge of second-degree murder. Her bail, which had initially been set following her arrest, was revoked as part of the indictment proceedings, meaning she remains in custody as the case moves toward trial. Because this case is still so new, much of what will ultimately determine its outcome, the physical evidence, any history of domestic violence between Joseph and Ikiek, the exact sequence of events on the night of March 27th, has not yet been fully presented in open court. What is confirmed, through the indictment and public police statements, is the basic outline: a fatal stabbing, an alleged confession describing a pattern of prior abuse, and a formal murder charge now proceeding through the Oahu Circuit Court. Cases like this one sit at an uncomfortable intersection for true crime coverage. On one hand, a man is dead, and the legal system exists to determine accountability for that loss of life. On the other, if the allegations of ongoing abuse prove accurate, the case raises the same questions that have surrounded countless domestic violence homicides across the country. Questions about what resources were available to Joseph before that night, and whether a different intervention earlier in the relationship might have changed the outcome entirely. As of this recording, Celine Sina Joseph has not been convicted of any crime. She remains presumed innocent, and her case is expected to proceed through pretrial hearings in the coming months. If you or someone you know is in an abusive relationship, help is available through the National Domestic Violence Hotline, and we'll leave that information in the description below. This case is a reminder of how complicated true crime can be. Please subscribe so we can bring you the verdict when it's reached. Now, we travel back to 1997 for a case that took 2 decades to come to light. Case 7, Ashleigh Wellman. Location, Pukalani, Maui, September 3, 2016. Not every case on this list involves a knife, a cover-up, or years of concealed abuse. This case is different, a single catastrophic decision, made in a matter of seconds, that ended 2 lives and forever altered a third. Haleakala Highway winds through the upcountry region of Maui, connecting the town of Pukalani to the slopes of the island's dormant volcano. It is a road locals know well, one that curves through open country before narrowing in places where oncoming traffic passes close together. On the night of September 3, 2016, Ashleigh Wellman was driving on that highway at what investigators would later describe as an excessive speed, reported at more than 80 miles per hour. At that speed, on a road not built for it, the outcome was almost inevitable. Wellman's vehicle crossed into the path of oncoming traffic and struck another car head-on. Inside that vehicle were Vincent and Debbie Raysai, a married couple, ages 56 and 54, whose lives ended instantly in the collision. The scale of the crash and the fact that 2 people died instantly meant that Maui prosecutors treated the case with the utmost seriousness from the outset. Wellman was charged not with the lesser offenses typically associated with fatal traffic collisions, but with first- and second-degree murder, charges that reflected the prosecution's argument that her conduct behind the wheel that night rose to a level of extreme recklessness and disregard for human life that went beyond ordinary negligence. What followed was a case that hinged less on the facts of the collision itself, which were not seriously disputed, and more on the question of Wellman's mental state. As the case moved toward trial, questions about her psychiatric history and cognitive functioning became central to her defense. Rather than arguing that the crash hadn't happened as described, Wellman's legal team argued that she could not be held criminally responsible for it, due to severe psychiatric illness that impaired her ability to understand or control her actions. The court did not take that claim at face value. 3 separate mental health panels were convened to evaluate Wellman's psychiatric condition, a level of scrutiny reflecting both the severity of the charges and the gravity of accepting an insanity defense in a case involving 2 deaths. All 3 panels, according to court records, reached findings supporting the conclusion that Wellman's cognitive capacities had been severely impaired by significant psychiatric illness at the time of the crash. In August of 2018, Second Circuit Judge Richard Bisson issued his ruling. Ashleigh Wellman was acquitted of the murder charges by reason of insanity. Rather than being released, she was committed to the Hawaii State Hospital, the state's secure psychiatric facility for individuals found not criminally responsible for their actions due to mental illness, where she would remain under psychiatric care and confinement rather than in a traditional correctional setting. The verdict was, and remains, a difficult one for many in the Maui community to fully reconcile. Vincent and Debbie Raysai did not survive a random, uncontrollable act of nature. They died because another driver chose to travel at a dangerously excessive speed on a highway shared with oncoming traffic. And yet the court's findings, based on repeated psychiatric evaluation, concluded that the woman behind the wheel that night was not criminally culpable in the eyes of the law due to the state of her mental health. This case remains one of the clearest examples in Hawaii's legal history of the tension between accountability for catastrophic loss of life and the legal standard for criminal responsibility when severe mental illness is credibly established. It is a case without a villain in the conventional true crime sense, only immense loss, and a legal system attempting to apply a consistent standard to an extraordinarily difficult set of facts. This case is a reminder that not every tragedy fits neatly into the categories we expect from true crime. Sometimes the legal system's answer is about accountability without traditional punishment. If stories like this make you think differently about justice, let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Next, we turn to the Big Island for a case involving the abuse of a minor that shook a small community in 2025. Case 7, Ashleigh Wellman. Location, Pukalani, Maui, September 3, 2016. Not every case on this list involves a knife, a cover-up, or years of concealed abuse. This case is different, a single catastrophic decision, made in a matter of seconds, that ended 2 lives and forever altered a third. Haleakala Highway winds through the upcountry region of Maui, connecting the town of Pukalani to the slopes of the island's dormant volcano. It is a road locals know well, one that curves through open country before narrowing in places where oncoming traffic passes close together. On the night of September 3, 2016, Ashleigh Wellman was driving on that highway at what investigators would later describe as an excessive speed, reported at more than 80 miles per hour. At that speed, on a road not built for it, the outcome was almost inevitable. Wellman's vehicle crossed into the path of oncoming traffic and struck another car head-on. Inside that vehicle were Vincent and Debbie Raysai, a married couple, ages 56 and 54, whose lives ended instantly in the collision. The scale of the crash and the fact that 2 people died instantly meant that Maui prosecutors treated the case with the utmost seriousness from the outset. Wellman was charged not with the lesser offenses typically associated with fatal traffic collisions, but with first- and second-degree murder, charges that reflected the prosecution's argument that her conduct behind the wheel that night rose to a level of extreme recklessness and disregard for human life that went beyond ordinary negligence. What followed was a case that hinged less on the facts of the collision itself, which were not seriously disputed, and more on the question of Wellman's mental state. As the case moved toward trial, questions about her psychiatric history and cognitive functioning became central to her defense. Rather than arguing that the crash hadn't happened as described, Wellman's legal team argued that she could not be held criminally responsible for it, due to severe psychiatric illness that impaired her ability to understand or control her actions. The court did not take that claim at face value. 3 separate mental health panels were convened to evaluate Wellman's psychiatric condition, a level of scrutiny reflecting both the severity of the charges and the gravity of accepting an insanity defense in a case involving 2 deaths. All 3 panels, according to court records, reached findings supporting the conclusion that Wellman's cognitive capacities had been severely impaired by significant psychiatric illness at the time of the crash. In August of 2018, Second Circuit Judge Richard Bisson issued his ruling. Ashleigh Wellman was acquitted of the murder charges by reason of insanity. Rather than being released, she was committed to the Hawaii State Hospital, the state's secure psychiatric facility for individuals found not criminally responsible for their actions due to mental illness, where she would remain under psychiatric care and confinement rather than in a traditional correctional setting. The verdict was, and remains, a difficult one for many in the Maui community to fully reconcile. Vincent and Debbie Raysai did not survive a random, uncontrollable act of nature. They died because another driver chose to travel at a dangerously excessive speed on a highway shared with oncoming traffic. And yet the court's findings, based on repeated psychiatric evaluation, concluded that the woman behind the wheel that night was not criminally culpable in the eyes of the law due to the state of her mental health. This case remains one of the clearest examples in Hawaii's legal history of the tension between accountability for catastrophic loss of life and the legal standard for criminal responsibility when severe mental illness is credibly established. It is a case without a villain in the conventional true crime sense, only immense loss, and a legal system attempting to apply a consistent standard to an extraordinarily difficult set of facts. This case is a reminder that not every tragedy fits neatly into the categories we expect from true crime. Sometimes the legal system's answer is about accountability without traditional punishment. If stories like this make you think differently about justice, let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Next, we turn to the Big Island for a case involving the abuse of a minor that shook a small community in 2025. Case 8. Chesiree aka Canite and Chancen Schutter. Location: Pahoa, Big Island, July 2025. Pahoa is a small, tight-knit town on the windward side of the Big Island, the kind of community where residents tend to know their neighbors and where news, good or bad, travels fast. In 2025, this community became the center of a disturbing investigation that had been building quietly, out of public view, for months before it ever became public. The Hawaii Police Department's Juvenile Aid Section had been conducting an investigation for approximately 6 months when it culminated in the exposure of what investigators alleged was the severe sexual abuse of a minor female. The two individuals identified in connection with the investigation were 37-year-old Chesiree Canite and her 34-year-old partner, Chancen Schutter. Investigations of this nature, particularly those involving specialized juvenile aid units, are typically conducted with extraordinary care and deliberation. Precisely because the evidence involved is sensitive, the victim is a minor, and the process of building a case that will hold up in court requires methodical, patient work that often takes far longer than the public realizes. The 6-month investigative window in this case reflects that careful process. Forensic interviews, evidence collection, and the kind of coordination between law enforcement and child protective services that is essential in cases involving alleged abuse of a minor. By the end of 2025, investigators had assembled enough evidence to bring the case before a grand jury. On December 29, 2025, a Hilo grand jury returned indictments against both Canite and Schutter. In January of 2026, the formal charges were announced: first-degree promotion of child abuse, 2 counts of first-degree sexual assault, and 2 counts of third-degree sexual assault. The charging decisions in this case reflect the layered nature of the allegations, not a single isolated incident, but a pattern serious enough to generate multiple distinct counts across different degrees of severity. First-degree promotion of child abuse, in particular, is among the most serious child protection charges available under Hawaii law, typically reserved for cases involving the most egregious conduct. Following her indictment, Canite was released on a substantial bond of $250,000, with conditions that included strict electronic monitoring, a set of release conditions designed to allow the legal process to proceed while ensuring that authorities maintained close oversight of her movements and whereabouts pending trial. As of this recording, the case against both Canite and Schutter continues to move through the Hawaii Circuit Court system on the Big Island. Both defendants are entitled to the presumption of innocence, and the specific factual allegations underlying each of the 5 counts against them will ultimately be tested at trial, should the case proceed that far rather than resolving through a plea agreement. For the Pahoa community, cases like this one tend to leave a lasting mark regardless of their ultimate legal outcome. A reminder that the work of child protective investigators, often invisible to the public until an indictment is announced, is happening continuously in communities across the state, and that the 6 months of careful, unseen work behind this case likely represents just one of many active investigations underway at any given time. If you suspect a child is being abused or neglected anywhere in Hawaii, you can report it confidentially through the Child Abuse Reporting Line, which we've included in the description below. Your call could be the reason an investigation like this one even begins. If this documentary has been valuable to you, please subscribe. It genuinely helps this channel keep producing careful, responsible coverage. Now, we return to Leilani for one of the most heartbreaking cases on this entire list. Case 9, Sina Pili. Location: Leilani, Oahu, December 22, 2023. Of every case in this documentary, this may be the one that generated the most public disbelief, not because the underlying facts were unusual for a child abuse case, but because of who the accused turned out to be. Sina Pili was, by every outward professional measure, exactly the kind of person a community would trust around vulnerable children. She held a master's degree in social work. She worked as a behavioral health specialist at a local high school, providing counseling support to students dealing with learning disabilities and behavioral challenges. She had, at various points, also served as an adjunct instructor teaching social work coursework at a local university. On paper, Sina Pili was a protector of children by profession. Behind closed doors, according to prosecutors, an entirely different reality was unfolding inside her own home in Leilani, where she and her husband were raising 5 adopted children, several with special medical and psychological needs. On December 22, 2023, first responders were called to the Pili family home after 11-year-old Ashleigh Pili was found unresponsive. According to the account later presented by investigators, on the day she died, Pili had sent Ashleigh, who was reportedly already sick, to run to and from a nearby chapel. Upon her return, according to police, Pili slapped and punched the child repeatedly over a period of approximately 30 minutes. Ashleigh was rushed to a nearby hospital, where she was pronounced dead. The autopsy findings that followed painted an extraordinarily disturbing picture. According to the medical examiner's report, Ashleigh's body showed extensive deep bruising across multiple regions, 2 fractured ribs, a hemorrhage beneath the scalp, marks consistent with bite injuries, and physical indicators consistent with strangulation. She had also, at the time of her death, tested positive for several respiratory illnesses, a detail that would later become central to the legal arguments made on Pili's behalf. Sina Pili was arrested and, following a grand jury proceeding, indicted on charges of manslaughter, endangering the welfare of a minor, and persistent non-support. She was held without bail, with the presiding judge citing a serious ongoing risk to public safety, particularly given that 4 more adopted children remained in the Pili household at the time of her arrest, all of whom were subsequently placed into protective custody as the case proceeded. The case moved through pretrial proceedings for more than a year. Pili's defense argued that the presence of respiratory illness at the time of Ashleigh's death complicated the medical picture, and pointed to the pressures of caring for multiple adopted children with significant medical and psychological needs as important context for the court to consider, while also raising procedural concerns about how the original grand jury indictment had been secured. Rather than proceed to a full trial on the manslaughter charge, prosecutors and the defense reached a resolution. On April 15, 2026, Sina Pili pleaded guilty, not to manslaughter, but to a reduced charge of first-degree assault, alongside guilty pleas to endangering the welfare of a minor and persistent non-support. The reduction from manslaughter, a more serious class of felony under Hawaii law, to first-degree assault significantly changed her sentencing exposure. Where a manslaughter conviction could have exposed her to as much as 20 years in prison, the assault charge to which she pleaded guilty carries a maximum penalty of 10 years. Sentencing in the case is officially scheduled for July 29, 2026, before the same circuit court judge who has presided over the case throughout its pretrial history. Pili's defense has indicated it will argue for probation rather than incarceration at that hearing, citing the circumstances outlined during the plea negotiations, while prosecutors have declined to comment publicly ahead of the sentencing date. For the community around Leilani, and for the extended family of Ashleigh Pili, the case has been especially painful given Pili's professional background. A woman trained and employed specifically to protect and support children with special needs stood accused, and ultimately pleaded guilty in connection with causing the death of a child in her own care. It is a case that has prompted uncomfortable conversations about how thoroughly the systems meant to vet and support adoptive and foster families are actually able to see into the homes they oversee. This case will conclude with sentencing on July 29th, and we will be covering that outcome as soon as it's handed down. Subscribe now so you don't miss it. If this documentary has moved you, please take 30 seconds to like the video and leave a comment. It helps us keep telling these stories responsibly. One case remains on our list, and it may be the most harrowing of all. Case 10, Lehua and Isaac Sonny Kalua. Location, Waimanalo, Oahu, August 2021. We end this documentary with a case that remains, even now, one of the most difficult in Hawaii's recent history to discuss. Not because the facts are unclear, but because of exactly how clear they are, and how long it has taken for the legal system to reach a final resolution. Isabella Ariel Kalua was 6 years old. She had been adopted, along with a sibling, by Lehua and Isaac Sonny Kalua, a couple in Waimanalo, a small windward Oahu community known for its beaches and its close-knit residential feel. To the outside world, By the accounts of neighbors at the time, the Kalua household did not present any obvious warning signs. According to the allegations that would later form the basis of the couple's indictment, the reality inside that home was one of sustained and calculated cruelty. Prosecutors alleged that Ariel was locked inside a dog cage, that her mouth was bound with duct tape, and that she was ultimately starved to death inside the family's Waimanalo home in August of 2021. What followed the child's death, according to the allegations against the couple, was not an immediate report to authorities, but weeks of silence and concealment. It was not until September of 2021, weeks after prosecutors allege Ariel had already died, that the Kaluas made a report to emergency services, framing it as a missing child case. The report described Ariel as having disappeared, a claim that, according to the case built against the couple, was fabricated from the outset to disguise a death that had already occurred and to delay discovery of what had actually happened inside their home. The fraudulent missing child report triggered exactly the kind of urgent, high-profile search response that such reports are designed to generate. Search teams, media coverage, and a community mobilized around the hope of finding a missing 6-year-old alive. That the search was, according to prosecutors, built on a foundation of deliberate deception only deepened the sense of betrayal once the truth began to emerge through the ensuing investigation. In November of 2021, an Oahu grand jury indicted both Lehua and Isaac Kalua on charges of second-degree murder, kidnapping, and hindering prosecution, charges reflecting not only the allegations surrounding Ariel's death itself, but the deliberate effort to obstruct and delay the investigation that followed it. More than 4 years after that indictment, the case remains active in the Hawaii Circuit Court system, a fact that reflects just how legally complex prosecutions of this severity can become. The case has been delayed repeatedly by mental competency evaluations for one or both defendants, a standard, legally required process anytime questions arise about a defendant's capacity to understand the charges against them or assist meaningfully in their own defense, as well as by extensive legal motions concerning witness testimony and evidentiary issues specific to the case. For a community that mobilized in genuine hope during the search for a little girl they believed was simply lost, the eventual allegations that her death had already occurred and that the search itself was part of a cover story represent one of the most painful betrayals imaginable. The prolonged legal proceedings that have followed, now stretching more than half a decade past the child's death, have left the community and Ariel's extended family still waiting for the resolution that a trial verdict would ultimately provide. As with every unresolved case in this documentary, we want to be unambiguous. Lehua and Isaac Kalua have been indicted, not convicted. They remain, under the law, presumed innocent, and the extensive delays in their case reflect the ordinary, if frustratingly slow, machinery of a legal system working through an extraordinarily serious set of charges. 10 cases. 6 islands worth of grief, courtrooms, and unanswered questions. Some of these stories reached their legal conclusion years ago. Others, Sina Pili's sentencing on July 29th, the ongoing prosecutions of Janae Perez and Ashleigh Utley, Sinaleen Joseph, Chesiree Canite and Chancen Schutter, and the long-delayed case against Lehua and Isaac Kalua, are still being written, right now, inside Hawaii's court system. That is the responsibility we take seriously on this channel. True crime storytelling only means something if it stays anchored to the facts, updates when the facts change, and never forgets that behind every case number is a real family still living with what happened. If today's documentary gave you a deeper understanding of Hawaii's most disturbing criminal cases, do 3 things before you go. Hit that like button, drop a comment telling us which case affected you most, and subscribe to Cold Case Hour so you're notified the moment we publish our follow-up coverage on the cases still awaiting trial. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next documentary.